We have seen that this response is effective, but we must now ask if it is ethical. Even the most effective responses could not be implemented if they were unethical in some capacity. To better understand how this response is truly ethical, we must do so through the lens of contractualism. This theory, founded upon Kantian ideals, is one that states that moral status and dignity arise from an individual being a rational, autonomous agent. Therefore, dignity is grounded in practical rationality, according to Kant. What practical rationality infers is that an individual possesses the capacity to set their own ends and acknowledge and act on moral reasons. Kant felt that this capacity is what separates humans from animals. While many may disagree on the basis of dignity being rationality, this sets up the central idea of contractualism, which states that the moral acceptability of principles for individual conduct or social institutions depends on whether each person could rationally endorse them under specified conditions or could not reasonably reject them. According to an essay written by Elizabeth Ashford explaining the concepts of both utilitarianism and contractualism, she explains that under contractualism, an action is right if and only if it is not prohibited by a set of moral principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one can reasonably reject. So, what constitutes a reasonable rejection? There are only two central features for the reasonable rejection of a principle, but both must be present to say that an act is not right. The first is that the rejection must be based on a single individual's reasons. This often means that an individual is making the claim that this particular act is burdening them in some way, and they are therefore not benefiting as they should or could without this act in place. In other words, this individual is thinking of their own situation. The second feature is that the individual must then complete a comparison of their burdens versus the burden of the individual or individuals who this act would be benefiting. This is a general comparison between the pros and cons of this act for the two parties involved. If it is found that the burden of completing this act does not outweigh the burden of the other party without the presence of this act, then this act cannot be reasonably rejected. A good way to think of this is an affluent individual complaining about the act of giving $10 to a homeless individual. The burden of the wealthy individual for giving the homeless individual $10 does not outweigh the burden of the homeless individual to find a meal without said $10. With this contractualist framework in mind, we can now complete a similar comparison of who is burdened with and without the proposed solution to determine if said solution is ethical. Let us look at who would be burdened under the proposed solution. Taxpayers would ultimately be expected to pay more taxes to fund state-sponsored treatment options for these individuals. Parole officers and institutions would take on a greater responsibility in monitoring the well-being of these low-level offenders under their supervision. Judges in the current legal system would have to adjust to these new sentencing options, and they would also have to determine the qualifications of a low-level drug offender. Incarcerated individuals who are not considered low-level offenders would not reap the benefits of this program. However, they would reap them in a way in which resources that were once diverted to individuals of low-level drug offenses would instead be allocated to these individuals. Finally, families of these individuals would feel as though their relatives are not being afforded the same opportunities for rehabilitation. This list is of course not exhaustive, but it highlights some of the more obvious persons impacted by implementation of this program. Now let us compare these burdens to the burdens experienced under the status quo without this program. Low-level offenders and all those who suffer from a substance abuse disorder would not reliably or dependably receive any treatment for their condition while in prison. This affects individuals like John, who cannot count on true rehabilitation from a supposedly rehabilitative system. Families of these incarcerated and sick individuals would have to see their relatives suffer and be unable to do anything about it. The prison system would remain overly crowded and overwhelmed, also affecting those other inmates, as prison resources would be severely limited. Finally, taxpayers would actually be paying more for the cost of incarceration over treatment, and they would also be paying more due to higher rates of recidivism and increased rearrests. Again, this list is also not exhaustive, but it does show that the burden of individuals under the proposed solution is much less than the burden for those under the current status quo. Therefore, using the contractualist approach, we cannot reasonably reject this proposal as the burden of those impacted without it, like John, is much greater than the burden of those impacted by its implementation, such as taxpayers. Overall, this approach posits that we must treat individuals as ends themselves and respect them as such, and for this reason and the one previously stated, its implementation cannot be ethically or morally rejected.
At the end of the day, this solution does only help a small number of individuals. However, not being able to help everyone won't stop us from helping who we can, because each and every individual matters.
We also anticipate that there will arise another counterargument as to why we should be asking taxpayers to spend their money on criminals. Firstly, this proposal is meant to target a group who is struggling with a mental disease, substance abuse disorder. While their actions in using drugs may be crimes, they are not being treated for the cause of their actions. Rather, they are being punished for having a mental disorder. As we explained before and will continue to stress, addiction is not a crime. Additionally, the affected group that this proposal is attempting to help is largely constituted by minorities who have been disproportionately targeted and incarcerated by our legal system. Combining these two facts, we can reach the conclusion that this affected population should not even be incarcerated in the first place, but should rather be receiving treatment for their mental condition. Now that we have established that this proposal cannot be reasonably rejected and thus should be implemented nationally, we would like to take a few moments to address some concerns about the recidivism statistics we presented earlier. These statistics reflect the effectiveness of voluntary treatments, including both ACT-ZAP and BTC. Therefore, their effectiveness cannot truly reflect what would be expected for the entire incarcerated population who struggles with addiction, as the reduced recidivism rates are for those people who volunteered. However, what this does mean is that these programs are effective for helping those who wish to opt in, and we should still fulfill our obligation as moral, dignified people to help even this small population.